Welcome to the Augmentation Mythic Plus guide for Season 3, and most likely for Season 4 as well. My name's BowserTheHealer, and let's beat the allegations. Realistically, Augmentation's got a bit of a bad name for itself. In lower keys and in pugs, a lot of players don't trust Aug players because they simply don't know what they're doing on the spec. However, a good Aug player makes a run so much smoother and so much easier while contributing tons of damage alongside its world-class utility. It's still picked in some world record teams and holds quite a bit of that top 0.1% title range. I want to help you get there, so let's talk about how we can play Augmentation and optimize it in Mythic Plus. I'll be going over the stat weights, the rotation, and everything you need to know about optimization one step at a time in this video. However, I do expect that you've at least played around with Aug or Evoker and know what a few of the buttons do, but I will be going over them and hovering over their abilities and the tooltips for you whenever possible. That being said, if you like healing content or augmentation content, hey, get subscribed, it'd mean a lot to me. Or if you just like listening to me talk about WoW, hey, I appreciate you. First things first, let's go over stat weights, and I don't want you to overthink this one. Mastery is the most important by far, followed by haste, but main stat is almost as important as mastery, so I highly recommend that you don't worry about your mastery at all outside of your jewelry and your trinket slots. Just get hero and mythic track gear whenever possible and swap out for mastery pieces later. When it comes to your trinkets, you might want to run something that just has mastery on it to keep it easy, but you can run things like the Mirror of Fractured Tomorrows if you like, because this is going to provide mastery when activated, and you can use this in, say, your Breath of Eons window, as well as something like Naimu's Unraveling Spindle, which is also great for augmentation. But as you can see, I'm a little bit lazy in that I'm just running the Leaf of Ancient Protectors because I like having an external in dungeons and a Caged Horror for damage, both of which provide mastery, which is all I need. Okay, let's go over a couple of pre-pull things. First of all, you're going to want to give Source of Magic out to a teammate, to your healer. Whenever you charge up an empowered spell, the more you charge it up, the more mana you give your healer. The talent below, Potent Mana, actually just gives them a flat 3% damage and healing. When you combine this with the fact that you have Black Attunement over here, which means when you're in your Black Attunement stance, you have 4% bonus maximum health, and so do your allies, that makes a healer's day a lot easier. So never leave home without these. Make sure your Source of Magic is on the healer at the start of the dungeon. And you shouldn't have to reapply it before the dungeon's over, because it lasts over an hour at this point on Augmentation. Blistering Scales is something that you put on the tank. It gives them 30% of your own armor, which is actually a pretty decent amount, and melee attacks against the user who has the Blistering Scales will have one of the scales explode, dealing volcanic damage to enemies near them. This does attribute to the player that it's on, so it's usually tank damage. And then with the way we talent, we give them more scales and we restore scales by casting Eruption. Furthermore, Reactive Hide is going to make them do more damage as they detonate, which helps it ramp throughout a pull. You can always remove this talent to run Inferno's Blessing. However, I typically run Reactive Hide because it tends to math out to be more damage for me, but this is going to be a dungeon by dungeon, pull by pull, group by group sort of deal. I like having this on, and you can just put it on and forget about it. Now, Molten Blood was run last season, where you get a little shield, and it's a stronger shield with lower health targets. However, Molten Blood got nerfed into the ground, and it's sort of useless in its current state in PvE. So if this ever gets buffed, I'll recommend running it, but realistically right now, you can just go for the regenerative, and you'll get this constant uptime on tanks, and you won't have to worry about reapplying your Blistering Scales. Also, as a final note, hit tip the scales before a dungeon start to get an empowered spell fully loaded and ready for pull. When the timer goes through, tip the scales will actually reset, so you can use one of these empowered spells, hit tip the scales, and then use the other empowered scale back to back. It's fun, little cheeky damage trick for you for the start of a key, and nothing else to it. Now that we've gotten some of the pre-pull utility out of the way, let's go through the rotation and some of the optimizations that come with it. Starting with Ebb and Might, this is the most important button that we have. It increases your damage by 22% and gives 4 of your nearest allies 6.5% of your primary stat to them as their own primary stat. This is pretty important because this is for everyone. The tank, the healer, and the DPS are all doing more damage, while you yourself are cranking out 22% more as well. Ebb and Might has a kind of insane range, like you can hit people in the auction house from here, which is kind of nuts. But also it ignores line of sight. So like this will work around walls and whatnot. So if you ever have to like duck into cover for something and press Ebb and Might, you're still going to deliver it to your teammates, which is pretty useful. Ebb and Might has a little timer that'll pop up right here whenever you get it. And using your empowered spells will make it go up by 2 seconds. Your eruptions will increase it by 1 second. Your Breath of Eons will add 5 seconds to the timer or turn on the timer for 5 seconds. And then you can use, say, Ebb and Might to extend the timer. Now, casting spells is pretty important to extend the duration of your timer, but there will hit this point where the timer is about to run out, you don't have any Ebb and Might left, and you're waiting for the cooldown to come back. You don't want to waste Ebb and Might, as the most important part of a pull is the start of a pull. So if you can get Ebb and Might running right as everyone starts doing their damage and roll it as long as possible, that's good. You might even get to use it twice in a pull. But if you ever feel like the mobs are about to die and you're not going to be able to Ebb and Might at the start of the next pull if you use it right now, it's worth holding. Trust me, while execute damage can be really nice, it's not worth losing the opening of a pull because you didn't have Ebb and Might ready. So always try to make sure this is up for the next pull. You might mess it up once or twice in a dungeon, and that's okay, but note that that is one of your largest, if not the largest damage loss you can have, other than messing up your Breath of Eons. So remember that. Now, before we talk about other spells, let's just go over Prescience really quick. This is a move that you have 2 charges of, and after casting 2 of them with our tier set, we'll get a third one that is much longer in duration. Prescience has a 35% chance to give us an Essence Burst, which will make our Eruption cast faster. More on that later. It also will power up our eruptions to do more damage. So getting our Presciences out is important for extending how often we have Prescience out and for doing more damage with Eruption. But its baseline ability is that it gives the target 3% critical strike chance, as well as Fate Mirror, this fantastic ability that gives people a chance to do 15% of their damage or healing they just did one more time. It's nice, it works in the background, but because you can get so many Prescience out, this move actually gets a bit of overtime right now in the season with the current tier set. So starting a pull by getting your Prescience out and then hitting Ebb and Might, or even getting your Prescience out on the way to the pull, is a pretty good idea. And before a dungeon, you can always pop both of your Presciences to get this empowered glowing one ready, and then you can sit on that for the start of a dungeon. It can make a nice difference. Your empowered spells are really important, but we're going to go over what they do first before we talk about your mastery, which is the real star of the show here. Fire Breath is a move you can charge up, and it does more damage up front rather than over time as you charge it. It also gives you Leaping Flames the more you charge it, which means for each empowerment level, you'll throw an additional Living Flame on your next Living Flame, which is more chances at an Essence Burst, which will make your next Eruption cast faster and not cost any of your Essence. Upheaval is just an AoE that you charge to make as big as it needs to be to hit all the mobs. It does do more damage to the primary target, but it's not a lot to really write home about. And just as a note, as Aug, you don't do any priority target damage whatsoever, even compared to healers. So my recommendation is to do as much damage as you can in AoE, which would normally be considered padding, but you can't really do anything about that as an Aug. It's up to your teammates to provide the priority target damage, and they will, because your mastery is going to super boost their damage. Your mastery has 2 parts, and the most important of which is Shifting Sands. By casting an empowered spell at any charge level, it does not change it, you will give one ally, preferring damage dealers, increased versatility by your mastery percentage. So me at 19% mastery right now means I'm giving out 19% versatility. Versatility as a stat is simply put damage output and damage reduction. So you'll get the full 19% damage output bonus, and whoever gets that versatility will also have a weaker, 9% something damage reduction. I don't know what half of 19 is off the top of my head. I don't know how to do math. This is one of the most important things in the game. Now, you can't give Shifting Sands to a DPS that already has it, and it does pick the target that is closest to you. So I highly recommend that you pick who you want to give it to first by moving closer to that target. That's less important at the start of a pull when all of your spells are ready, and a lot more important when we talk about optimization later. Now, just like Ebb and Might, if you're going to use an empowered spell at the end of a pull, you're going to waste your Shifting Sands if the mobs don't live long enough. Aim for about 70% uptime. Do you think the mob's going to live for another 7 to 8 seconds? Well, then maybe the empowered spell is fine. If you don't think they're going to live that long, then it's probably worth just waiting till the next pull. The most amount of damage that happens in a pull is at the start of a pull, and we'll be talking all about that in just a moment. Eruption is your spender for essence. This is our unique resource that we have, and this is what we use to extend our Ebb and Might timer once we've used our other spells. This is also what we hope to get Essence Burst for. Oh, please, you're not going to give me an Essence Burst game? That's rude. Because Essence Bursts are going to allow us to cast a quicker, no-cost version of Eruption, and we really like that. And furthermore, you're going to get more damage out of your eruptions when you have Prescience out because of our tier set, and those mini eruptions that happen when we do this also adds to the timer. You don't really have to do anything different, just make sure your Prescience is on cooldown, and when you cast an eruption, you'll get bonus time and bonus damage out of it. So when your Prescience is on cooldown, your eruptions hit harder. That's all there really is to it. It will affect the next eruption, so get them all on cooldown. You can spend them on one eruption, or you might have a charge right now, you use an eruption, you get a charge later. It doesn't matter, it's bonus damage. We love that. Living Flame and Azure Strike are sort of our filler moves. When we're waiting for our next Ebb and Might, we're just casting these in order to get an Essence Burst. You have a 15% chance on your Azure Strike and a 20% chance on a Living Flame. Now, there's a choice note up here. Pupil of Alexstrasza will send out 2 Living Flames instead of 1, while Echoing Strike will give you a 10% chance for any of your Azure Strike hits to echo and cast again. It's nice, but realistically, I'm going to leave this one up to you. I think Pupil of Alexstrasza is a lot more consistent, but if you're moving, you're going to press Azure Strike, so if you think you're going to be moving a lot more often, then maybe Azure Strike's better. But you're quite literally doing this usually to get an Essence Burst to cast Eruption, or because you're farming up Essence Burst for your next Ebb and Might cooldown. That's all there is to it. These moves aren't too important, and other than your Leaping Flames from your Fire Breath, you're not going to be worrying about them very often, ever. So that is all the tools in the basic rotation. So at the start of a pull, walk into the room or hover into the room, get your Prescience on cooldown, and as the pull starts, hit your Ebb and Might. Then I recommend getting your Fire Breath to level 4, your Upheaval as big as it needs to go, then cast all of the eruptions you have, every Essence Burst you got, and extend that timer as long as you can. Then when you're out, Living Flame in hopes to get more Essence Burst. Then when you're completely out, use your Presciences in hopes to get more, and then there might be a point where you're kind of running out of time, but Ebb and Might's coming back up, and if you played your cards right, you should be able to cast Ebb and Might again and keep everything going. This rotation's pretty simple, and I highly recommend that you just use this in the training area for a little bit to get a sense of the flow of the spec, because if everything's going perfect, it's a very simple and albeit kind of boring rotation, but it's never easy. Mythic Plus doesn't go perfect, things go sideways, and we have our big cooldown Breath of Eons to talk about, and everything can and will fall apart. So let's talk about that move and all of the optimization that comes with it. Also, just before I talk about anything, if you saw me throw an instant Living Flame, that's actually a PvP ability. I just forgot to turn off War Mode. Whenever I cast Ebb and Might, I get an instant cast Living Flame. Very cool in PvP. Not really something that I'm using very often in dungeons because you can't use PvP abilities in Mythic Plus. All right, moving on. Breath of Eons is our big 2-minute cooldown. Just like Deep Breath, it's immune to CC. It can stun if you talent for it and all that cool stuff, but you're not going to use it for those things. You're going to use Breath of Eons as a damage button. So you fly over the targets, hitting them with temporal wounds, which will accumulate 11% of damage dealt. And I like to refer to it as like copying the damage. So for 12.8 seconds, it will copy 11% of your teammates' damage and your own damage, anyone affected by Ebb and Might. Then at the end of its duration, it criticals and blows up, which is pretty nice as arcane damage. First thing we have to talk about, this is the biggest mistake every evoker makes. Make sure you're paying attention. Breath of Eons must blow up for it to be useful. Breath of Eons does absolutely nothing if it doesn't blow up. Even in a 25 4-5 Blackrook hold, which you will have footage of on screen right now, I as a healer got to witness in a 25 the mobs dying before Breath of Eons detonated. So it can happen even at a higher level. So just keep that in the back of your mind. It's very important that you time this move so that it blows up. But how do you use the move in the first place? Well, same as normal rotation. Get your Prescience on cooldown, then pop your Ebb and Might. This is a good time to use your Power Pot, your Naimu Spindle, or anything else. Then when you're done with that, tip the scales Fire Breath, Upheaval, then Breath of Eons as quick as you can. I like to hit Hover afterwards, and then cast all of your eruptions. Get them on cooldown. Then use your Leaping Flames and continue doing damage. And then when the Breath of Eons expires, it'll detonate doing damage. Now you might be thinking, Bowser, what if I put my own damage into the Breath of Eons? Wouldn't we want my empowered spells to be in that Breath of Eons? Yeah, your damage isn't very high. You do okay damage, but in terms of Breath of Eons, your damage isn't going to be, well, really anything compared to the other DPS. So powering them up is a bit more important than you putting your own damage into it. Furthermore, this is optimal. Sometimes you need to get the Breath of Eons out faster, in which case you might open with the Breath of Eons, then use empowered spells, then use Ebb and Might. I like to call that the struggle of Eons, but realistically, whatever gets it to work is fine by me. Now, what if the mobs are dying too quick? Well, typically you're going to hear me say in the coming parts of this video, I want you to window Breath of Eons and your Shifting Sands in people's cooldowns. However, if people are doing too much damage, then you need to desync your Breath of Eons and use it when people don't have cooldowns, which can be a really wonderful way to get more Breath of Eons off. Remember, it's important this move actually does its damage, so missing people's cooldowns might sound like it sucks, but realistically, if you can get it to blow up and do damage, it's contributing more than if it was wasted. And also you might find that somebody has cooldowns up more often, like say an Arms Warrior, so you can maybe just time it with an Arms Warrior instead of your Arms Warrior and your Evoker, which might do too much damage at once and blow up all the mobs. And if that doesn't work, yeah, it's single target time. Using Breath of Eons only on bosses feels bad, and typically speaking, you want to use the Breath of Eons when everyone sends their cooldowns on a boss, when they bloodlust, or on say damage phases like the extra damage on the tree boss in Everbloom. Yeah, you're going to want a Breath of Eons when that damage phase starts so that everyone does extra damage into your Breath of Eons. It doesn't feel good, but try not to overthink it. If you're in a low enough key level that everyone's flying by and blowing up the mobs too quickly, you're probably not going to run out of time in that dungeon unless everyone starts dying. Keep an open mind about it. You'll get more Breath of Eons as the key level goes up, and that's sort of normal as DPS typically do more damage as the key level goes up because mobs live long enough for them to get their full combos and the full use out of their rotations. Okay, on to the next optimization of the spec. Yes, so windowing Shifting Sands for your empowered spells is the next big thing. I'll have an Omni CD profile down below that's built for augmentation, and if you see any of my footage, you're going to notice anything to the right of a health pot is a damage ability. Anything left or below is a defensive or a utility, and it doesn't really matter for healers, but healers sometimes it's a little messed up, but that's okay because you're not trying to window Shifting Sands on a healer. Now, as you learn the DPS specs, you'll do more damage knowing when to pop your cooldowns in line with them. But realistically, the most amount of damage in every single pull is the start of a pull. So I was originally going to make this big graph that went over all the specs and kind of where their damage was. But the answer is, outside of a couple of them, most of them are two kinds of profiles. Either they take a moment to ramp up and do damage very quickly into the pull. Some of them are very much like a flat line, like Survival Hunter and Outlaw Rogue, that just do very consistent damage all the time and are rarely spiking, or when they're spiking, it's RNG or a cooldown being used. Arms Warrior and Devastation Evoker, for instance, are very upfront damage, so you're going to want to window them quickly. They're going to blast a ton of damage right at the start and then start to fall off as the pull goes on. However, there are things like Affliction Warlock, Fire Mage, and Unholy DK. These specs do take a little bit longer to ramp up. Now, would you want to hold your cooldowns for a long period of time? No, but you can hold it for a few GCDs. So let's pretend that there's a player right here, right? Let's say that's a warrior, and this training dummy could be the Fire Mage. I might walk into a pull, right? I got my presciences out, I start the pull, I Ebb and Might, and then I use the first empowered spell next to the warrior, then 2 to 3 GCDs of casting Eruption. I don't want to see you do too much more than that. Then an Upheaval. This little desync is a good way to capture more of an Affliction Warlock or Fire Mage or Unholy's damage without giving up too much of your own personal damage. But if you wait any longer than that, I would argue you're getting into the territory of wasting your CDs. And without extensive testing with your friends' damage profiles on really high level keys, you will be losing damage. So I recommend you just send those moves early in the cooldown whenever possible. I recommend you send these moves at the start of pull whenever possible, because that will be the most amount of damage. And if you can accommodate for something that's a little slower, like Affliction Warlock, Unholy, or Fire, then yeah, you can do that little delay. But that's all I ever want to see you doing. If you worry about this too much, you're going to be missing damage. More is better on augmentation, so try to get more of these out rather than precisely timing everything. Now, as much as there's great offensive capabilities, Augs get taken for their good defensive abilities, and I don't want to hear that any of you skipped this part. If I have one more Aug go into my key and Zephyr something that can't be Zephyred and Obsidian Scale randomly, I'm going to scream. Aug has a lot of utility, and let's start with Draconic Attunements. You have 2 Draconic Attunements. You have the Black Attunement and the Bronze Attunement. Black Attunement's going to give you and your 4 nearest allies, which is your whole Mythic Plus party, 4% increased maximum health. Bronze Attunement's going to give you and your 4 nearest allies 10% increased movement speed. Bronze Attunement, however, you're not going to have to worry about too much. I recommend having Black Attunement on a button so that you can swap into it whenever possible, because giving your teammates extra health is part of the reason why Aug is so special. You get to bring this extra defensive capability to your team. However, whenever you activate Obsidian Scales for Black Attunement or Hover for Bronze Attunement, which is separate from using the stance buttons that they are normally, you're actually going to get an empowered version of those moves. So if you use Hover, you're going to get Bronze Attunement empowered, and you're going to have 40% move speed for 5 seconds. And if you use Obsidian Scales, you'll get bonus 8% maximum health for 15 seconds. That is a sizable defensive. So if you can use this defensive to help the whole team out, you're in good shape. And remember, you have 2 charges of Obsidian Scales with the Wavy talent. You also have a cheat death. Using your defensives a little more sparingly for the party and less for yourself is totally fine, because if you do die, you have a cheat death. Now, with 2 charges of Scales, you can also use it as a defensive and then still potentially have one up for the whole party. But you might be going, Bowser, when do I use group defensives? Don't I have to be a healer for that? No, not at all. In fact, outside of the occasional mob like the Nauseous Eruption from the Abominations and Everbloom, there aren't a lot of mobs you're going to learn as the keys get higher when you want to send those. It's boss fights. And realistically, think of where bosses do large amounts of AoE damage, or even just a large amount of damage to an individual player. You can use Obsidian Scales to help save them, which is pretty important. You have other tools for helping people as well, but if there's a large amount of AoE damage that isn't avoidable, like say the Shadow Bolt Volley and Blackrook Hold, yeah, then that's an Obsidian Scales angle and you can save the party's life. However, we also have access to Zephyr, a 2-minute cooldown that gives us 20% avoidance. This would work in Blackrook Hold on, say, the Amalgam of Souls. After the Soul intermission, there's a big AoE amount of damage, and Zephyr will work on that. So let's say like 3 souls got absorbed on Tyrannical and you're worried the team's gonna die, pop Obsidian Scales, pop Zephyr, and you'll put out a chunky amount of defenses for your team that hopefully combined with their own personal defenses will keep the party completely safe. Just let your team tell you when they want Obsidian Scales. I know as a healer, I occasionally ask augmentation players to use Obsidian Scales at a certain time, so feel free to ask your healer if there's anywhere that they want a defensive. Another defensive utility we have is Rescue. Rescue can be talented to take Twin Guardians, which gives you and the other person you rescue 30% of your maximum health as an absorb shield. This is a really wonderful defensive, and you use it to quickly save your buns or somebody else's. And note that Rescue does not break channels, so feel free to grab a caster that's in the middle of a spell. You're not going to ruin their day. And finally, you have Renewing Blaze, which takes 100% of the damage you take and heals you back over 8 seconds. So if a mechanic isn't lethal, you can use Renewing Blaze to help stay alive. Combined with Verdant Embrace and Emerald Blossom, you can heal yourself or others when the going gets tough. But try not to over focus on your external healing, because while you're okay at it, you're still a DPS. You should still be focusing on damage whenever possible. Your Tail Swipe and your Wing Buffet are going to get a pretty large workout. Not to mention your upheaval's up pretty often, and knockups have no diminishing returns. So you can actually knock mobs up multiple times in a row to interrupt spell casts and, you know, CC mobs with little to no punishment for doing so. Your natural rotation should be stopping casts every once in a while, which is pretty great. The final utility I'll just mention briefly is Oppressing Roar, and that this allows for extra crowd control timing on targets that are hit. However, unless you know a pack is going to be crowd controlled to hell and back, this is more of a coordinated ability, but it's nice to keep around. On Raging Weeks, you can grab Overawe, which is going to allow it to be an AoE de-enrage, which has quite a lot of uses, so keep that one around on the Raging Weeks. Remember that Cauterizing Flame and Expunge are your dispels. Expunge is only poison as augmentation, and Cauterizing Flame is everything but magic, including bleed. Make sure you have these moves nearby because dispelling is very important, and I've met so many DPS that don't know how to do it. Make sure that you're comfortable doing it, and I'll be proud. Once you start nailing all the rotational stuff and you get a sense of the flow of Ebb and Might and getting your damage out and empowering your teammates, It's smooth, it's easy, and it's a ton of fun. There are a lot of things that can go wrong in a dungeon, and Aug has a surprising amount of tools to keep things together when they have no business surviving. So use Aug to support runs, help people do more damage, and they won't feel like they're carrying you. They're going to feel like they were blasting out of their minds. And I hope you do too. I hope you have a ton of fun with this spec. Let's beat the allegations, because realistically, I think the spec is super cool still. I'm happy with its current balance, and I hope that more people give it another chance now that you have to work a little bit harder in order to get the value out of it. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you have questions, hit me up in that comment section, and I will see you all soon.